As winter approached, the Soviet military received a much-needed boost with the arrival of freshly mobilized reserves in early December. This influx of troops brought their numbers up to par with those of the Axis forces, marking a significant turning point in the conflict. Furthermore, intelligence revealed that a minimal Soviet presence in the east would be enough to keep the Japanese Kwantung Army at bay, freeing up resources for a bold counterattack. And so, on December 5th, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire front, pushing the German troops back 100 to 250 kilometers in a matter of weeks. The relationship between Japan and the United States had been deteriorating since the early 1930s, following a series of incidents, including the Mukden incident, the shelling of the USS Panay, and the Nanjing massacre. By 1939, tensions had escalated to the point where the US decided not to extend its trade treaty with Japan. As American public opinion turned against Japanese expansionism, the US government imposed economic sanctions on Japan, including a ban on exports of vital materials like chemicals, minerals, and military parts. In Asia, back in 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. China appealed to the League of Nations for help, but Japan withdrew from the organization after being condemned for its actions. The conflict escalated, with battles erupting in Shanghai, Rehe, and Hebei. Eventually, the Tanggu Truce was signed in 1933, bringing a temporary lull to the fighting. However, Chinese volunteer forces continued to resist Japanese aggression in Manchuria, Chahar, and Suiyuan. In a surprising turn of events, the Kuomintang and Communist forces put aside their differences after the 1936 Xi'an incident, agreeing to a ceasefire in order to present a united front against Japan. This marked a significant shift in China's response to Japanese aggression, as the two former adversaries joined forces to counter the growing threat. In 1939, Japan launched a series of attacks on the Chinese city of Changsha, but was ultimately repelled. Seeking to increase pressure on China and prepare for a potential war with Western powers, Japan invaded and occupied northern Indochina in September 1940, cutting off supply routes and positioning its forces for a potential showdown. In early 1940, Chinese nationalist forces launched a massive counteroffensive against the Japanese. However, the unity between nationalist and communist forces was short-lived. By August, communist forces had launched their own offensive in central China, prompting Japan to retaliate with brutal measures in occupied areas to weaken the communists. As tensions between nationalist and communist forces escalated, they clashed in January 1941, effectively ending their cooperation. The Japanese army attempted to take advantage of this division, attacking the nationalist 19th Army's headquarters in March, but were repelled at the Battle of Shangao. As an alternative, Japan turned to Southeast Asia, where German victories in Europe emboldened them to pressure European colonies for resources. Although the Dutch agreed to supply Japan with oil, negotiations for further access stalled in June 1941. To secure resources, Japan sent troops to southern Indochina in July, threatening British and Dutch territories. This move prompted the United States, United Kingdom, and other Western nations to freeze Japanese assets and impose a total oil embargo. Japan had been planning to invade the Soviet Far East, but abandoned the plan due to the economic sanctions. As the United States and Japan struggled to repair their deteriorating relationship, in early 1941, they engaged in a series of negotiations aimed at ending the ongoing war in China. However, the Japanese proposals presented during these talks were deemed unsatisfactory by the Americans. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands were collaborating on a joint defense strategy to protect their respective territories in the event of a Japanese attack. In a show of strength, President Roosevelt bolstered the defenses of the Philippines, a U.S. protectorate slated for independence in 1946, and issued a stern warning to Japan. Any attacks on neighboring countries would be met with a response from the United States. As Japan struggled to cope with the crippling American-British-Dutch sanctions, Emperor Hirohito grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. Initially hesitant about Japan's chances of victory, Hirohito eventually came to favor entering the war. This led to the resignation of Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, who was replaced by War Minister Hideki Tojo, a choice that marked a significant shift towards militarization. On November 3rd, Admiral Nagano presented a detailed plan for the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to the Emperor. 2 days later, Hirohito gave his approval for the war plan in an imperial conference. Meanwhile, Japan's new government made a final offer to the U.S., proposing an end to American aid to China and the lifting of the oil embargo in exchange for a promise not to attack Southeast Asia and a withdrawal from southern Indochina. However, the U.S. counterproposal on November 26th was non-negotiable, demanding Japan's unconditional withdrawal from China and the conclusion of non-aggression pacts with all Pacific powers. This ultimatum left Japan with an impossible choice: abandon its ambitions in China or seize the necessary resources by force. The Japanese military saw no option but to pursue the latter, with many officers viewing the oil embargo as a tacit declaration of war. In a bold and strategic move, Japan aimed to create a vast defensive perimeter stretching from Asia to the Central Pacific by seizing European colonies. This would allow them to tap into Southeast Asia's resources while wearing down the Allies through a defensive war. To achieve this, Japan planned a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet and American forces in the Philippines. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a coordinated assault on British and American territories in Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Thailand, and Hong Kong caught the Allies off guard. In response, the United States, United Kingdom, China, Australia, and several other nations declared war on Japan. However, the Soviet Union maintained its neutrality due to its ongoing battles with European Axis powers. In a show of solidarity with Japan, Germany and other Axis nations declared war on the United States, citing America's attacks on German war vessels as justification. This marked a significant escalation of the conflict, drawing more nations into the global war. By the end of April 1942, Japan and its ally Thailand had made swift and sweeping conquests, claiming Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and Rabaul as their own. The Allied forces suffered heavy losses, and a large number of prisoners were taken. Despite fierce resistance from Filipino and U.S. forces, the Philippine Commonwealth fell in May 1942, forcing its government into exile. In a dramatic turn of events, 7,000 British soldiers found themselves encircled by the Japanese 33rd Division in Burma during the Battle of Yananyang. Just in time, the Chinese 38th Division arrived to rescue them on April 16th. Japan's naval prowess was also on full display, securing victories in the South China Sea, Java Sea, and Indian Ocean. In a bold move, Japanese forces even bombed the Allied naval base in Darwin, Australia. However, amidst these easy victories, Japan's only setback came in January 1942, when Chinese forces emerged triumphant at Changsha. Japan's swift successes had left them overconfident and overextended, setting the stage for future challenges. In May 1942, Japan launched a bold plan to capture Port Moresby, aiming to sever the vital supply lines between the United States and Australia. However, their ambitions were foiled when an Allied task force, led by 2 American fleet carriers, clashed with Japanese naval forces in the Battle of the Coral Sea, resulting in a stalemate. Undeterred, Japan devised a new plan, driven by a desire for retribution after the Doolittle raid. They aimed to seize Midway Atoll, lure American carriers into a trap, and simultaneously occupy the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Meanwhile, in China, Japan launched the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign to punish those who had aided the surviving American airmen, but fate had other plans. In late May, American codebreakers cracked Japanese naval codes, exposing their strategy and order of battle. Armed with this knowledge, the Americans achieved a resounding victory at Midway, crippling Japan's capacity for aggression. With their momentum stalled, Japan attempted to capture Port Moresby through a grueling overland campaign in Papua. Meanwhile, the Americans hatched a counterattack plan, targeting Japanese positions in the southern Solomon Islands, particularly Guadalcanal, as a stepping stone towards capturing Rabaul, Japan's key base in Southeast Asia. As the summer of 1942 drew to a close, two key battles emerged in the Pacific theater. In New Guinea, Japanese forces initially pushed forward with plans to capture Port Moresby, but by mid-September their focus shifted to the battle for Guadalcanal. Troops in New Guinea were ordered to retreat to the northern part of the island, where they faced off against Australian and American forces in the intense Battle of Bunagona. Meanwhile, Guadalcanal became a crucial focal point for both sides, with heavy deployments of troops and ships. The battle raged on, but by early 1943, the Japanese were defeated and forced to withdraw their troops from the island. As the spring of 1942 unfolded, Germany and its allies managed to halt a massive Soviet counterattack in central and southern Russia, retaining most of the ground they had gained the previous year. The tide began to shift in May, when the Germans successfully repelled Soviet offensives in the Kerch Peninsula and Kharkov. Emboldened, they launched a major summer offensive in June, targeting the oil-rich Caucasus region and the Kuban steppe. The German forces split into two prongs. Army Group A pushed towards the lower Don River and then veered southeast towards the Caucasus, while Army Group B advanced towards the Volga River. The Soviet forces, determined to make a stand, chose the strategic city of Stalingrad on the Volga as their defensive stronghold. As the bitter battle for Stalingrad raged on, the German army came close to capturing the city by mid-November. However, the Soviets launched a fierce counteroffensive in the midst of winter, encircling German forces at Stalingrad and attempting to break through the Rzhev salient near Moscow. Though the latter effort ended in disaster, the German army suffered heavy losses by early February 1943. Their forces at Stalingrad were defeated, and the front line was pushed back to a point beyond its pre-summer offensive position. In a surprising turn of events, the Germans launched another attack on Kharkov in mid-February, after the Soviet counteroffensive had lost momentum. This bold move created a salient in their front line around the strategic Soviet city of Kursk, setting the stage for a new phase in the battle. As the war raged on, the German Navy seized upon the weaknesses of the American Naval Command, wreaking havoc on Allied shipping along the Atlantic coast of the United States. However, the tide began to turn in North Africa, where Commonwealth forces launched a bold counteroffensive in November 1941, dubbed Operation Crusader. This successful campaign reclaimed all the territory that the Germans and Italians had previously gained. But the Germans refused to give up, launching a fresh offensive in January that pushed the British back to the Gazala line by early February. In Libya, Axis forces unleashed a fierce offensive that sent the Allies reeling, forcing them to retreat deep into Egypt. But the Allies dug in their heels at El Alamein, halting the Axis advance. The Allies achieved a crucial victory in August 1942, fending off a second attack against El Alamein and managing to supply the besieged island of Malta, albeit at a great cost. This success paved the way for a counterattack in Egypt, which led to the Axis forces being driven out and the Allies embarking on a westward push across Libya. Shortly thereafter, Anglo-American forces landed in French North Africa, prompting the region to join the Allied forces. The Allies then launched a strategic bombing campaign against Germany, aiming to cripple the war economy, erode morale, and displace civilians. The campaign began with devastating firebombing raids, including the infamous attack on Hamburg, which left significant casualties and widespread destruction in its wake. Following the Guadalcanal campaign, the Allies shifted their focus to eliminating Japanese forces in the Pacific. In May 1943, Canadian and U.S. forces joined forces to drive the Japanese out of the Aleutians. Meanwhile, the U.S., supported by Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islander forces, launched a series of operations aimed at isolating Rabaul by capturing nearby islands and breaching Japan's Central Pacific defenses at the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. By the end of March 1944, these objectives had been achieved, and the major Japanese base at Truk in the Caroline Islands had been neutralized. On the Eastern Front, both German and Soviet forces spent the spring and early summer of 1943 preparing for massive offensives in central Russia. On July 5, 1943, Germany launched an attack on Soviet forces around the Kursk Bulge, but their advance was swiftly halted by the Soviets' robust defenses. In a significant turning point, Hitler called off the operation within a week, marking the first time he had done so without achieving tactical or operational success. The tide of World War II began to shift on July 12, 1943, when the Soviet Union launched a series of counteroffensives that crushed any hopes of German victory, or even a stalemate on the Eastern Front. The decisive Soviet victory at Kursk marked the end of German superiority, giving the Soviets the upper hand. Despite desperate attempts to hold the line, German forces were breached at Smolensk and the lower Dnieper, forcing them to retreat. Meanwhile, on September 3, 1943, the Western Allies launched a bold invasion of the Italian mainland, capitalizing on Italy's armistice with the Allies and the subsequent German occupation. However, Germany responded swiftly, disarming Italian forces, seizing control of key areas, and establishing a series of defensive lines. In a daring move, German special forces rescued Benito Mussolini, who went on to establish a puppet state in German-occupied Italy, sparking a brutal civil war. The Western Allies fought valiantly, pushing through multiple defensive lines until they reached the main German stronghold in mid-November. As the Allies gained momentum in 1943, German operations in the Atlantic began to falter. By May of that year, the Germans had suffered significant submarine losses, forcing them to temporarily halt their naval campaign in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the leaders of the Allied powers were meeting to discuss strategy and post-war plans. In November 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met with Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek in Cairo, where they agreed on the post-war return of Japanese territory and planned the Burma campaign. They then met with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in Tehran, where they solidified plans for the Western Allies to invade Europe in 1944, and for the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan once Germany was defeated. As the war raged on, a significant turning point came on January 27, 1944, when Soviet forces launched a massive offensive that finally broke the devastating siege of Leningrad, ending the longest and deadliest siege in history. The Soviets then pushed forward, but their momentum was temporarily halted at the pre-war Estonian border by German forces and Estonian nationalists, hoping to regain their independence. This delay slowed the Soviet advance in the Baltic region. Meanwhile, by late May 1944, the Soviets had achieved significant victories, liberating Crimea, driving Axis forces out of Ukraine, and making inroads into Romania, although they were repelled by Axis troops. June 6, 1944, marked a pivotal moment in history as the Western Allies launched a massive invasion of northern France, known as D-Day. This bold move came after 3 years of relentless pressure from the Soviet Union. The Allies also redirected troops from Italy to launch a secondary attack on southern France, achieving significant success. As the Allies advanced, they defeated German army units in France, leading to the liberation of Paris on August 25th. The city's freedom was secured through a joint effort by the local resistance, the Free French Forces, and the Western Allies, all under the leadership of General Charles de Gaulle. Although the Allies faced setbacks, such as a failed airborne operation in the Netherlands, they continued to push German forces back in Western Europe. In Italy, progress slowed due to a formidable German defensive line. In Slovakia, a national uprising was also crushed by the Germans. But in eastern Romania, the Soviet Red Army's offensive led to the destruction of German troops and sparked successful coups in Romania and Bulgaria, causing both countries to switch allegiance to the Allies. As the war raged on in 1944, Soviet troops made significant gains in Yugoslavia, forcing German army groups E and F to retreat from Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia to avoid being cut off. Meanwhile, the communist-led partisans, led by Marshal Josip Broz Tito, had been waging a successful guerrilla campaign against the occupation since 1941 and controlled much of Yugoslavia's territory. In a joint effort, the Soviet Red Army and Bulgarian forces assisted the partisans in liberating Belgrade, the capital city of Yugoslavia, on October 20. As the war in the Pacific raged on, American forces made significant strides against the Japanese. In mid-June 1944, they launched a bold offensive against the Mariana and Palau Islands, culminating in a decisive victory in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This crushing defeat led to the downfall of Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who resigned in the aftermath. The American triumph also yielded a crucial strategic advantage: air bases from which to launch intense bombing campaigns against the Japanese mainland. Building on this momentum, American forces invaded the Filipino island of Leyte in late October, paving the way for another resounding Allied victory in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history. In a significant turn of events, the Red Army launched an attack in Poland in mid-January 1945, rapidly advancing from the Vistula to the Oder River in Germany and overrunning East Prussia. As the war in Europe entered its final stages, the Soviet Union and Western Allies made significant gains against Nazi Germany. In February 1945, the Soviets pushed into Silesia and Pomerania, while the Western Allies entered Western Germany and reached the Rhine River. By March, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, encircling the German Army Group B, and the Soviets launched a failed offensive to protect their oil reserves in Hungary. The final blow came in late April as Soviet troops stormed and captured Berlin, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Italian forces surrendered on April 29th, followed by the capitulation of the Italian Social Republic on May 1st. The capture of the Reichstag on April 30th signaled the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany, bringing an end to the war in Europe. As World War II neared its end, significant leadership changes occurred. President Roosevelt passed away on April 12, 1945, and Harry S. Truman took over as President of the United States. Meanwhile, Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, was killed by Italian partisans on April 28, 1945. In Germany, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz succeeded him as President of the Reich, while Joseph Goebbels became Chancellor. However, Goebbels also took his own life the next day, and Lutzgraf Schwerin von Krosigk took over. The war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. Although some German forces continued to resist, all remaining members of the German government were arrested by the Allied forces on May 23, 1945. The Allies took control of German political and military institutions through the Berlin Declaration on June 5, 1945. In the Pacific, American forces, aided by the Philippine Commonwealth, made progress in the Philippines, clearing Leyte by the end of April 1945. They landed on Luzon in January 1945, recaptured Manila in March, and continued fighting on various islands until the war's end. The U.S. also launched a firebombing campaign against Japanese cities as well, including a devastating raid on Tokyo on March 9, 1945, which remains the deadliest conventional bombing raid in history. As World War II neared its end, Allied forces made significant gains against Japan in May 1945. In July, Allied leaders convened in Potsdam, Germany, reaffirming their demand for Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if refused. As the Allies closed in, the Japanese government refused to surrender unconditionally, hoping to negotiate better terms. But on August 6 and 9, 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing unprecedented destruction. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, defeating the powerful Kwantung Army. These devastating events finally swayed Japan's Imperial Army leaders to accept surrender. The Soviet Union also seized control of southern Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. On the night of August 9th, Emperor Hirohito made the historic decision to accept the Allies' terms. He announced his decision to the Japanese people in a radio broadcast on August 15th, marking the end of Japan's resistance. The formal surrender documents were signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, bringing an end to World War II. The war that had ravaged the world for 6 years, claiming millions of lives, destroying cities, and reshaping the global landscape, was finally over. As the Allies celebrated their hard-won victory, the world began to look towards the future, determined to rebuild and create a more just and peaceful international order.